Hi everyone, thanks for waiting. So I think we're 1 minute past the hour, so I think we can make a start. If everyone can hear, if you could just raise your hand, that would be great. Lovely. Thanks all for confirming. I've had a bit of trouble with the audio before. So yes, so thanks everyone for joining. So let's start today's training. So welcome to the second quarter for PD training. We unfortunately missed the first quarter. There weren't any major updates. They are included in here as a short summary. So if we've got time, we can go into those. So the format for today, so first of all, I will talk about improved rule visibility. There's a couple of tools that we would like everyone to make use of, so I'll just touch on them briefly. Then talk about a new approach that we are taking towards certification. And then finally go through the rule updates and clarifications that were issued very recently in May. And also, as I mentioned, touch on the previous ones that we didn't manage to cover last quarter. So in terms of better visibility, so we sort of listened to people's feedback about rule updates in that they were a little bit challenging to find. So hopefully you're all aware that there is now a fully dedicated rule update and clarification page. So I'll just explain briefly the difference between an update and a clarification. So a rule update is quite a significant change, generally that's been sanctioned by the Gold Standard Technical Advisory Committee. And clarifications, they tend to be issued a bit more frequently because obviously they're not really something that TAC are involved in, and it's usually when a rule is not clear or there is a certain interpretation that needs clarifying. The general principle for both of these rule updates and clarifications, anything you see on that page will be incorporated into the next version of the standard. And for those of you who don't know, it's due September 2019. So it's actually not that far away, so in 3 months' time. So I'd just like to show this page for those of you who are not aware. So here it is, web address up at the top there. So updates and clarifications are separate on here. All of these opened, and then you can read the relevant documents section. But really what I wanted to draw your attention to was the sign up to the rule update list here. So if you put your name, your last name and your email address and submit, you will be updated automatically whenever there is a change on this page, which we think is quite a good way to stay in touch. You won't receive any communication materials, anything like that. It's just very strictly for rule updates. So moving on to talk about our new approach. So we're working on a more consistent and efficient approach to reviews. And this is really moving towards a target of being fully digital by 2020. Many of the sort of checks that we do and VVBs do could actually be automated or facilitated by the use of IT. So we recognise that, and we're working towards it and investing on it. But meanwhile, there's a few things that we can do. So one of the things that will appear very shortly is a slight change to the review feedback templates. And the one that you'll notice most change in is the preliminary review template. And so I will talk about what preliminary review means and how it's supposed to help project developers in the following section. So one of the things to note for design and performance reviews, so that validation and verification reviews in old speak, is we will be asking VVBs to respond more to our queries rather than rely on project developers to do so. So this is similar to how it works in CDM. We think there are a number of advantages in that closer communication between VVBs and ourselves can only be a good thing. And if I suppose if we rely on project developers to respond to things, it's not always ensured that VVBs are aware of the issues that we are raising. So in short, we hope that it will lead to greater consistency over time. So something that we are going to do to help with consistency of reviews is to implement an improved VVB performance management system. It will focus on key areas. So for example, additionality or monitoring plan, and we'll feed these back to VVBs. So again, strengthening that that communication with VVBs so that they're aware of the issues that are important to us in certification. So refresher on preliminary review. Preliminary review is intended as a guide to the project developer, and it doesn't represent the certification review or result in certification. So everything that you see on this page is quoted from the standard. So I'm just going through it to explain and remind. There are 3 possible outcomes of preliminary review. So number 1, a successful review without any CARs, FARs or OBS. Number 2, a successful review with likely or potential CARs, FARs or OBS, but that are not required to be resolved prior to listing. And what you'll see in bold is that matters pertaining to eligibility need to be addressed prior to listing. And the third outcome, which obviously no one wants to see, is an unsuccessful review with at least one non-conformity identified. So to summarize really from that, preliminary review shouldn't check everything in detail or it duplicates validation. And it should focus on those issues which have a significant bearing on eligibility and also the stakeholder consultation process. So essentially this could be the outcomes of the preliminary review can be summarized in one of 2 ways. You know, if you're fundamentally irredeemably ineligible, you can't go forward to listing. But if you broadly meet the eligibility criteria and you meet the key ones, then you have other issues that can and of course must be resolved before validation. You can progress to listing. So those 2 points, we can just show some examples. So an example where you know it's something that is irredeemably unfixable, if you like, is where a project developer has submitted for retroactive registration later than 1 year after the project start date. So this isn't a fact that's going to change through validation. It's not something that can be resolved. So really, it's ineligible at preliminary review, so it cannot progress to listing. In a similar fashion, if a PD's project technology is not permitted under GS4GG, in theory, an application could be made to Gold Standard to get approval for the new technology. But for now, for the purposes of the preliminary review, the project's deemed ineligible, so it cannot be listed in its current form. So just giving those examples of more minor issues, really, assuming that full eligibility has been demonstrated in the key areas. If, for example, a project developer has not provided an original participants list in their stakeholder report, this is okay, you know, because it can be uploaded in time for validation. And the way that we would address that is via a likely CAR, just to make it clear to the VVB that this thing is needed before a project can be validated and design certified. Taking another example, if the project developer's continuous input and grievance mechanism expression method, that's a bit of a mouthful, is not appropriate to local stakeholders, this can of course be revised in time for validation. So again, our approach to that would be to issue a likely car. So if something isn't checked in detail during preliminary review, it's intentional. It's going to be checked during the VVB review, and even if that doesn't happen, it's going to be checked in design review or potentially performance review as well. So it is intentional if something doesn't appear as an issue in preliminary review. And really what we are seeing preliminary review as is a signpost to areas that VVBs must check. And so just to aid clarity on this one, we've updated the preliminary review feedback form just to really separate the issues out. So where things are deemed to be likely or potential cars, there's a separate section for it. And we've also promoted FARs to the very start of the feedback form. If those of you, I guess, are familiar with these feedback forms will be aware that FARs were always at the end of the form, and potentially they could be lost or not immediately obvious. And so we've kind of raised their profile by putting them at the start of the form. So clarification and corrective action requests, so things that need to be resolved before listing, these appear in the usual place, so in the comment request boxes. Just show you this on screen. So just highlighted the major changes. So you'll see here there's the two boxes. So a box for summary of likely corrective action requests. Recall that there's no response required and in a similar vein, forward action requests, there's no response required. So it's really a record for the VVB to consider in their validation. However, we have a corrective or clarification request that must be resolved, so something pertaining to eligibility principles, then it's going to appear in the usual place. So in the comment request box, and the project developers required to respond in the usual fashion until the matter is satisfactorily resolved. So hopefully that all adds a bit of clarity. Because of the way that we're structuring this, it's doubly important that BVBs receive a copy of the preliminary review feedback form. Checking this in design review, so it's really important that it's passed on so that the VVB has this record of the signposts, really, of the issues that we've identified as being something that have to be dealt with, or something that very likely need to be. So hopefully that was a useful refresher on preliminary review. Now we can go into talking about the rule updates that were issued by Gold Standard in May. So at the end of May, one of the things we're trying to do is time these training sessions around periods when rules are updated. Hear about the rules in a different way. So what follows is talking about the rule updates, but talking about them in slightly simpler manner. Just to provide a good introduction, really, for people who are interested. So the first topic is the rule update concerning municipal solid waste incineration requirements. So this rule change allows MSW incineration activities that fire both non-renewable and renewable waste to qualify for GS4G certification. So previously that wasn't allowed. So there are a few eligibility tests for this. The first of which is that MSW incineration projects must generate energy from the waste in an efficient way, and this energy must be in the form of electricity and or heat. The second key point is that projects using waste materials that are used by others before the project is not eligible unless it can demonstrate with convincing evidence that the users of the waste before the project are happy with the change in use. So that's not the be all and end all. It is possible in the absence of an agreement with people using materials before the project starts, that project developers, if they can demonstrate that the project makes use of surplus waste materials, then that is also okay. And there's two different ways that that's demonstrated, and it's according to the size of the project. So first of all, for projects that are equal to or smaller than 15 megawatts or 45 megawatt therm, i.e. Traditional small-scale projects, project developers need to demonstrate once in time for validation that the project's using surplus waste materials, i.e. no one else is using them. And a slightly different rule for larger scale projects, so things greater than 15 megawatts or 45 megawatt therm. The same demonstrations required in time for validation, but also at the time of each verification as well. So something else that projects need to do to become eligible is that they must implement a waste management awareness program, for example, education campaigns, to encourage stakeholders to adopt best practices in waste management within the project boundary. And furthermore, the success of this program must be evaluated at a minimum of every 2 years following the date of design certification. So those are the basic eligibility tests. There are other requirements as well. So namely, against the stakeholder consultation, project must consult with local communities who are living in the nearby area and who may be impacted by the project, so either negatively or positively. So there must be a meaningful conversation with these groups. In terms of emissions and operational requirements, host country regulatory requirements differ, and reflecting the fact that to get gold standard certification, the most stringent regulations should be followed. A project needs to compare the host country regulatory requirements with the most recent version of the EU regulations on these type of plants, and they should submit the comparison table at preliminary review. So the project needs to comply with the most stringent regulations out of the two, so host country versus EU. And if at any point a requirement of the applicable regulations has been breached or is being breached, the project developer needs to inform the gold standard immediately. They also need to immediately take measures to restore compliance within the shortest possible time. And in addition, if a breach poses immediate danger to human health or potentially will cause an immediate significant adverse effect on the environment, the project will be withdrawn from gold standard until compliance is restored. Monitoring requirements. So in addition to the waste management awareness campaign that needs to be monitored every 2 years, projects need to demonstrate compliance with applicable regulatory requirements, and they need to do this within 6 months of the operational start date, and annually thereafter. So it needs to be demonstrated within 6 months because it's recognized that when these things start, it can take a time to get the system running optimally, but it does need to be running properly and complying with laws within 6 months rather than any year. And so this compliance, of course, will be checked during verification. For those years when verification doesn't happen, the information regarding compliance needs to be included in the annual report that is required. So if you recall, annual reports are required in years when verifications do not take place. So it's very important that that is used as a way of demonstrating annual compliance against the regulatory requirements. The next rule update to talk about is converting gold standard CDM projects to VERs. So what this rule change means is that all GS eligible CER projects can issue gold standard VERs. And there's two main ways to do this. I think in the rule update, it's called something different. So it's called Annex B, which if you do actually click on the expand the comment, it does tell you that it is about CDM project activities. Makes it a bit clearer. So I'm just making sure the link is clear for you guys. There are two main ways, as I mentioned. So the first one, there isn't any big change on this really. So the conversion of GS-CERs to VERs. If a project wants to issue VERs in this manner, it can maintain its CDM registered status. The second way that a GS CDM project can issue VERs is by converting completely to a VER project. And in this case, the project would lose its CDM registered status. So just to talk about the process for conversion of GS CERs to VERs. So process is as follows in 4 steps. CDM projects need to be registered as gold standard CDM first. I guess that's fairly obvious because you can't issue gold standard CERs without that fact. And that's the second point really, that the project must issue the CERs and successfully apply for gold standard labeling. Once these have been issued, the project must transfer the gold standard labeled CERs into the gold standard registry account. That's the preferred option. There is another way in which CERs can be cancelled, proof supplied, and along with the reason for cancellation. In both instances, the point being that the CERs cease to exist. And the reason for it is also clear. And then finally, once the relevant fee has been paid, Gold Standard will issue an equivalent number of GSVERs to the project in the Gold Standard registry. So talking about the process for converting a Gold Standard CDM project to a VER project. So as mentioned, it needs to be deregistered. It's important that it's voluntarily deregistered. Obviously, if it's deregistration for another reason, it's perhaps some more issues there that need to be checked. Voluntary deregistration is carried out using a form. There's a link on the bottom of the screen for those of you who are interested. But anyway, evidence of deregistration from CDM needs to be provided prior to submission for design review. Projects can submit for preliminary review with the deregistration process pending. Once that's all happened and deregistration has been approved, the normal cycle is followed. So nothing really to comment on that. As with any other project, it can opt for combined design and performance certification. And so in this instance, the VVB can combine site visits and the preparation of their reports. And so a final note that the CDM project already undergoing the gold standard registration process can completely switch to VRs at any point. So that's really talking about a project that's taking a parallel track, aiming for CDM and also aiming for gold standard at the same time. So again, a key principle behind that is that the CDM part needs to stop. So there are a couple of other things to talk about in the conversion process. So methodology and tools. So it's a rule in GS4GG that all projects need to use the most up-to-date version of the methodology or tool at the time of first submission. And so therefore it's the job of the VVB to validate the PDD for any gaps between the version used for the submission for Gold Standard and the versions used to register the project under the CDM. Some important points on crediting period. So once a project transitions across to GS4GG, like any other project, it's eligible for retroactive crediting for a maximum period of 2 years prior to the date of Gold Standard registration. In terms of claiming the remaining CDM crediting period, that's totally fine, but it cannot claim more than the maximum crediting years allowed under the relevant GS4GG activity requirements. And obviously that includes retroactive crediting as well. Activity requirements have different maximums, as I'm sure you're aware. The majority of them, so renewable energy and community services, are 15 years. So, but the default is actually 10 in the absence of any activity requirements. So that's the amount available. The third and final point is that the project needs to follow the 5-year crediting cycle after it transitions to Gold Standard for the global goals. And so just illustrating how those concepts come together. So we're taking an example, a renewable energy project with a 7-year renewable crediting period. This one has issued 3 years of CDM credits. So upon transition to a GS4GG VER project, it's able to claim just the 2 years GSVERs before it has to renew under GS4GG, because 3 + 2 = 5, and it's a 5-year crediting cycle in GS4GG. And noting as well that the project is eligible only for a maximum of 15 years, because that's what the renewable energy requirements stipulate is the maximum. So if we recall at the start of the presentation, there's rule updates and rule clarifications. So there's rule clarifications are generally a bit more subtle. There's actually only one to talk about, and it's regarding automatic additionality demonstrated via CDM tool 32. So the 2 projects of interest are landfill gas recovery and its gainful use, and methane recovery in wastewater treatments. It's essentially the same principle applies to both of these projects, in that, yes, you can use these tools, but there are still going to be additional GS eligibility criteria projects that you will need to follow. And so slightly different for these 2 examples, and I've just highlighted the main one for landfill gas recovery is that project activities planning to make use of waste materials already in use before the project are not eligible unless there's a convincing evidence of agreement. So hopefully you'll recall that's a similar principle from the MSW example before. So projects need to comply with that even when using this tool. So there are other points that will apply, but they'll be dependent on what activity requirements are applicable to your project. But I think that is the most important example to share. So for methane recovery in wastewater treatment, the most important example to talk about is that type of project related to palm oil production. You may be aware that Gold Standard has a fairly stringent approach to palm oil projects, and so in essence any project that comes to us and it's using palm oil, then it's going to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis at the time of preliminary review. So A possible outcome might be use of expert stakeholders to assess the project to see whether it's eligible, that sort of thing. But yeah, so those are the scheduled topics. So we've done half an hour. There's some other key rule updates that were not covered in the last session, but perhaps we'll pause for see if there are any questions at this moment. So, okay, we have a few questions, and they're all from Ha Huang. I hope I've said your name right, Huang. Ha. Okay. Well, a bit of housekeeping. So if anyone does have questions, I'll do my best to answer verbally. But just to kind of make sure that we give a very good response, we'll also send a written transcript of any questions that are asked. So, it may well be that there's some question that, I don't know the answer from the top of my head, and probably have to do a bit of research and checking with colleagues as well. So we will publish an update after this call. So anyway, turning to the question. So will other MSW technologies such as composting be considered to be eligible for Gold Standard? I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure that the composting is eligible. It's there would be if there's a methodology on it. So in the impact methodologies page on the standards website, there is a list of CDM projects that CDM methods that PDs can follow, and there's usually a note saying talking about the extra eligibility requirements that CDM meth projects need to follow to be registered for GS4GG. So I'll look into that after this call, I think, and just provide a bit more of a detailed answer. So the next point, in case a CDM project which started more than 1 year, converting their CERs to VERs. Okay, so it's a good question, and again, it's from Ha. So yeah, in essence, CDM projects are exempt from the 1 year eligibility rule, if that makes sense. So the concept that projects need to submit documentation to Gold Standard within 1 year of the start date is only applicable to VER projects. So yeah, thanks for that question. That's a good one. And third question from Ha. In case of converting a CDM project to GS4GG, can they remain using the old version which was applied, or do they need to apply the latest version of the methodology? So as mentioned, they need to use the most up-to-date version at the time of submission. So, assuming that there is no change in the methodology, they can use the one that was used for CDM, but if not, I'm afraid it's updating tools and methodologies. So as mentioned, I'll prepare probably a more detailed response to those questions. I'll just go through, being as though we have some more time, I'll go through a reminder of some key rule updates and clarifications from the past 6 months. So just show those now. Yeah, the main one to talk about really is increased eligibility for the Gold Standard Renewable Energy label. So a refresher for those who may not be immediately familiar. So it started life as a quality label for renewable energy certificates, and the quality in that label is the kind of thing you'd usually expect from Gold Standard. So certifying SD contributions, certifying that project is complying with safeguards and has ongoing stakeholder consultations. There are a number of different types of renewable energy certificates. So guarantees of origin, tigers, Green E, but the one that is only applicable at this moment in time is the IREC. And there's some, the background to why CDM projects were not previously eligible for the renewable energy label is that CDM do not prevent issuance of IRECs and CERs from the same megawatt hour. This is a key requirement in the renewable energy label product requirements, and this is to preserve the environmental integrity, so that there's only one person buying all of the environmental attributes of a project. And so because of the fact that we cannot prevent CDM in effect double issuing from a megawatt hour, the position was always, okay, well, in that case we can't really offer this label for CDM projects, whereas there's been some work behind the scenes, and that's basically to come up with an approach to mitigate the risk, and it's essentially a legal safeguard with some checks to see if projects are double issuing from the same megawatt hour, and stiff penalties upon discovery. So we just talk about that in a bit more detail. So the legal safeguard is that project developers need to declare in writing that they will not issue both CERs and renewable energy certificates from the same megawatt hour for any project that's registered with Gold Standard. And so that is a commitment, really, that if a project chooses to issue a straight CER without Gold Standard awareness, that if it's remaining registered as a Gold Standard project, there is a commitment not to issue a renewable energy certificate as well. And in terms of tracking, so PDs need to include monitoring parameters for issuance of each type of product. So Gold Standard CER, straight CERs, renewable energy certificates, GS labeled renewable energy certificates versus the net megawatt hours supplied to the grid, just as a transparency exercise to make sure that no duplication happens, and just to make project developers aware that the issuance of both schemes will be tracked by GS and our partner IREX, and also VVBs. There are penalties, they're quite stiff. So upon discovery, projects need to retire CERs, VRs corresponding to the megawatt hour double issued plus 25%, possible project deregistration, and possible suspension of all projects within portfolio for 5 years. So the possible nature refers to basically how serious the mistake is, whether it's a genuine mistake or whether there's an actual attempt to really defraud the system. So it's, in essence, it's based on trust and also a bit of verification of that trust. Another point is regarding erroneous inclusions. So this is a clarification rather than a rule update. So it concerns non-conformities in eligibility identified in POAs. So it's when essentially the eligibility criteria have not been met, and this usually occurs at verification. There are 2 different types, and there are 2 different procedures. So this is not really explained in the standards, hence why there's a clarification on the standards rule update page. Non-systemic erroneous inclusion occurs when one activity has been picked up with an erroneous inclusion and it doesn't apply to others. So for example, when one issue is relevant to one technology, there's only one of that technology within the POA. So all of our activities can proceed to performance certification. So let's imagine a scenario, there's a POA with solar and cook stove VPAs, and it's found that a solar VPA, one of the eligibility requirements was that it had to have a certain certain power size. It had to be 20 watt peak on the panel, and it was found that there were smaller panels on site, so that would affect all of the solar VPAs that were kind of co-verified, but it wouldn't affect the cook stove VPAs. And systemic is one that is identified in one activity that may reasonably be present in others, and so all activities that are affected are put on hold until the issue is resolved. So an example there would be cook stoves, let's say, and there was an issue present in a cook stove VPA, and the VPAs were group monitored together, and so if an issue is spotted in one and there was a group verification, then it follows that the other 4 VPAs are probably likely to have that same issue present, and so therefore they would need to be put on hold. So that's it. That's a rundown of the historical rule updates and clarifications. Are there any other questions before we go? Please raise your hand if you have one. You're also very welcome to email. That works as well. No, it seems there are no further questions. So thanks, Ha, for your questions. So I'll prepare a written response to them and share with all of you who've attended today. Thank you very much for joining, and we will see you at the next session. Thanks a lot. Bye.